We are live. Thank you. Um, Shumail, I'm just trying to connect to the Facebook page as well. Okay, I see myself now. Perfect. We are live. Thank you. Okay. So how do I access the comments over here? Hi guys, can you watch this? Can you just comment so I see that you're with me here? So it's a different environment in which we're doing this. We've done a few philosophy circle sessions before at T2F. You know, they've obviously not been virtual. We've had people um, sitting at T2F, and they've been very lively. Been a lot of active discussions back and forth. Um, so we're doing this in a different scenario, obviously because of the lockdown and COVID. But I hope that this session can be just as engaging, just as lively as all the other sessions we've had previously. Okay, thank you, Taha, for pointing out. You can hear me. It's good to hear. So yeah, I mean, I would really want that you guys can comment in as much as possible. You know, share your ideas as much as possible, so that we can make this a lot more engaging. And you know, even though this is a virtual connection, we can still get the most out of today's session, right? Because ultimately, philosophy isn't just about, you know, one guy projecting his or her ideas. It's just about how mutually we can share ideas, how mutually we can um, make criticisms, learn from each other, debate and discuss in a respectful manner, right? So that's what I hope for. I think we have 13 people online right now, which is a decent number considering it's raining a lot today, and you know a lot of people don't have electricity. So let's start. I think let's not delay any further. Shumaila, if you can please put up the presentation. Thank you. So yeah, today is the third session of the Awami Falsafa series that I've been doing at T2F as part of the philosophy circle. I just wanted to give you uh, a brief about myself as well as an overview about the sessions we've done in the past. My name is Danial, and I did my studies in philosophy in 2010 when I went to the LSE, and I specialized in the philosophy of economics. So you'll see that a lot of my discussions are based on ideas either in political theory or in economics, and that makes it a lot more interesting, in my opinion, in the Pakistani context, because people are in Pakistan. People are very politically active. Everyone is very opinionated. We all have our own ideas, and even though unfortunately we're not really exposed to philosophy or politics, the study of politics, the way Western societies are. But I believe that if these concepts can be introduced to our discussions, then our discussions can be a lot more interesting. They can seek out the right answers more appropriately, and it can really enrich our our discussions altogether. And whatever I've introduced so far are concepts that are not too abstract. They're not too distant as one usually thinks about philosophy. That it's just somebody sitting on their in their armchairs and theorizing about how the world works. But these are very relevant concepts, certainly very pertinent for all sorts of public matters. So just to give you a few examples of the last few topics that we've done, the first series, the first lecture that we did was one that discussed on the idea of admission rights by schools, right? So what would be the most fair criteria in terms of admissions in a school like Lyceum, for example, like KGS, like LUMS, or not necessarily, or private institutes, but also public institutes. What should be the most fair criteria for taking in the brightest students? And that discussion, though, drew from a lot of philosophical themes. We discussed how ideas of Aristotle, of Kant, of Jeremy Bentham apply to these discussions. And even though they're ideas discussed as early as maybe 2000 or more years ago, they're still very relevant even when talking about policy design today, right? That was the first topic we did. The second topic we did was on the ideas of taxation, on giving the most appropriate incentives to the hardest and smartest workers in our society. How do you ascribe a fair wage for people? How do you decide on what somebody's worth is in terms of the income that they earn? Should school Hello. Okay, so I've reconnected. I hope the audio situation has been sorted now. So yeah, that was just a quick brief of the topics we've been discussing previously. I'm going to jump into the heart of the topic today. So the question today is, does collective choice matter, right? And more importantly, is it even possible? Is the idea of social decision making even possible? you know so a lot of us talk about majority vote. A lot of us talk about democracy. We prefer the idea of a group making decision collectively rather than being dictated by one or a few individuals. So I want to start off with just hearing your views on what do you think about the idea of collective decision making. Feel free to comment your ideas if you'd like to come up on stage on this virtual stage. We can also do that. But in any case, feel free to share your comments on what do you think is your opinion on um, why does collective choice matter. So let's see what the audience has to say. I think there's a bit of a delay in terms of when you guys are commenting and when I'm saying something. So there might be a bit of a time lag in the response times. Let's be wary of that. Mhm. Okay, so not a lot of responses received so far. It could be, people aren't perhaps that active in a virtual environment. So I'll just share my ideas with you instead, right? Let's put up the presentation up again, Shumaila, please. So it's quite understandable why there is a growing demand for the public opinion on having decisions being made collectively, right, rather than individually. So that's not limited only in the political context. Oftentimes when we talk about democracy, here's interesting. Sayyid Muaz Shah has mentioned something about a Federalist paper. Would Muaz Shah like to be invited up on this virtual platform and perhaps enrich this discussion through his ideas? Shumaila, can we see if that's possible? Can we invite Sayyid M. Shah on board and hear his views? It's amazing. See, finally, we're making the most of this virtual environment. And that's how philosophy is supposed to be, getting more voices heard. You don't just want to hear me throughout this session. So, Sayed M. Shah, you've been given a link. You can connect on through that and join us.
Yeah, I think I'm on now.
Oh,
Yeah,
perfect. Welcome on board.
can you hear me? Yeah, no, definitely.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
can hear you
And I've
fine.
always been excited to join this series. So I think you. Yeah, I think I'm on now.
Mhm. Glad to have you on board, Moaz. I hope you can forgive the slight time delays involved. It's a virtual setting that we're experimenting on,
No, no,
and we're still learning from it. So
it's
the
absolutely all right.
question for today is,
I think everybody's learning in this
um,
environment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, Mars, the question today is, does collective choice matter? And if it does, in your opinion, is it even possible? And purely from a theoretical point of view, I'm not talking about the sort of practical limitations associated with it, but even just from a theoretical point of view, how possible is the idea of making decisions collectively, in your opinion?
Like you said, theoretically, there could be, the assumption that we could go with where groupings of people have been identified in a certain way. People have grouped themselves in ways of families and religious tradition and culture, and that has structured their thought process. They've agreed to certain values, and so their thinking process, they have come to an agreement that it's along these lines, whatever it may be. Like I said, it could be family, it could be culture, it could be religion. So in that sense, there is a collective thought that has agreed to a basic structure. Of what that basic structure is in every society or tribe or culture may be different. And some places we call it a constitution, or we term it in that way. And sometimes that's written, sometimes that's unwritten. A sense of tradition is also used. So collective thought, in that sense, I guess you can theoretically argue that it can be done to that limited extent. But now, how do we grow from there when it comes to the practicalities of that? How do you put that? How do you implement that? What do those words mean, or some of those traditions mean? What were they there for? What was the reasoning behind that? And that, I think, when the newer generations come, they feel like, well, we were never part of that process. We were never connected to that process. We would like to kind of change things because of the situation or circumstances that now a bunch of younger people or newer generation, or the next level of people that come afterward, have. So there's that, that level of discussion as well. So
Right.
theoretically, I think there is a basic structure, a base structure, let's just say, that can be created that when people come together on what basis, different basis, but it is possible to have that. But can that structure exist for a later time period? Is it appropriate? Of course, these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Can we impose that thought process, that basic structure on the ones that come in the future? And that's a question, I guess, that, So I do think collective thought can be had. You can establish certain things, but is it stuck just in that time space continuum? And what can we take from that? So that's what I would say in respect to that. And I'll just follow up on
Great,
the
great
comment.
contribution. Yes, please
Yeah,
do.
the comment that you had, because well, your discussion had triggered me to remember, in America, when America was being founded as a country, there was a lot of discussion on what it should be. So one of the former presidents of America, James Madison, at that time was one of the leaders in the revolutionary time period. So there was a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, and they expressed their ideas of democracy and what are the challenges that they would face, and convincing the people what sort of system of government they would embrace. And so within that discussion, there was a Federalist Paper number 10, and I remember this very starkly, because in there, James Madison was very critical about democracy and rule of the people and the collective rule. And he, theorized, or in his political theory, he said that this is essentially, the 90. If you have a group of 100 people, 99 can theoretically vote in law that would suppress or violate certain rights of the one. And that is what pure democracy is, because that's what the majority wants. So if the majority wants to violate the rights of the one or the minority, then they can theoretically pass that in, and that is what pure democracy is. And so he was critical of that, and he said that we should think about a Republican model of government. He didn't even call it a democratic republic; he called it a Republican model, in which he said in a Republican model there are certain inalienable rights, and of course the Republican model traces its roots back to the Roman concept of a republic, in which Roman citizens had certain basic rights and the Roman canon law, and so that couldn't be violated by anybody at any point in time. So that was something that was what he kind of had triggered in the discussion. I think a lot of people think, and there's a misperception that democracy is somehow a fair, the collective have gotten together and it's representation of the people and all that. And no, there's some very critical things against such a system. And we've just had that discussion on collective reasoning. I mean, and can is it what was called pre-eternal. Is it forever? What this collective thought
Mhm.
process a certain group of people had, and what do you do with that? So, I mean, of course, you have the concept of amendments and so forth to constitutions, if you want to be particular to law, but tradition, in family structures, how long, that, how do we keep on with the tradition? So, anyways, I'll let you take the discussion.
Perfect. No, Moz, thank you so much. I think you've given a lot of interesting ideas. And just to summarize what you've said, I think the first criticism that Moz made was the idea that the earlier generation can make certain decisions for later generations. So, in essence, the people who are voting for something aren't the people on whom the decisions are being applied to, right? So there's a difference in the agencies, but that's a slightly more complicated issue to be addressed, which we won't keep in the scope of today's discussion. But the other thing that you pointed out about, the 99 being able to oppress the one, that's quite relevant, and I want to draw your everybody's attention to that point because it what it highlights is that one of the prerequisites of democratic decision making is that there's some sort of a majority decision to be taken, right? So you do want to value the idea that whatever the majority decides should be applied, but that doesn't necessarily mean that rights cannot be violated through this process, and then maybe you're oppressing a certain minority, which can very likely or can be a potential outcome of majority decision making. So if in that scenario you do pose certain caveats to this decision-making procedure, well, then are you moving away from democracy and you're going to some sort of other method or not? So these are some ideas to sort of keep in mind. Thank you, Moz. We'll put up the presentation back again, and you'll feel free to comment more. Um, We've got some more input from other people as well. Javed Safdar says that collective decision making is important, but not at the cost of delay. So yeah, that's a very good point as well. Sometimes decisions need to be made urgently. You don't have that time to do like a proper voting and everything. So should we just give that right to a certain few nominated individuals and let them take the lead? So, very good discussion. I'm quite impressed by the sort of inputs that I've had so far. Um, but interestingly, I want to draw your attention to the fact that when we talk about collective choice, it's not just limited in a political context, right? I mean, yes, naturally, politics is the first thing that comes to our mind, but it can be applied to a social context. It might just be a group of friends deciding where they want to go out for lunch, right? So if they're 10 friends and they want to decide amongst whether they want to go to KFC or have pizza or have kebab, what aggregation procedure, so to speak, are they going to use in order to come up to that group decision? You certainly don't want that one individual uh, dictates where everybody needs to go, right? That wouldn't be a very fun environment if one person is making the decision for the entire group and saying, "Hey, we're gonna have Nando's because I like Nando's, so deal with it." So there are obvious reasons why, even in a social context, we might favor a collective choice. In an economic context, in business, you want to understand, what maybe the will of the shareholders are for a company. You want to understand how the market's perception is on a particular product. So, in all these scenarios, it's in our interest to be able to find out what would be the most appropriate mechanism through which you can aggregate all these individual preferences that people have and be able to say that this is what the group has chosen, right? So, what would be that method through which you can say that I can combine all the different individual preferences that are out there and I will generate this social output and I can confidently say that this is the will of the people. So, do you guys want to comment on what do you think that method, that apparatus would be in order for us to uh, generate a social preference from amalgamating a list of individual preferences? What would that method be? I'll give you some time to comment. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, while you do that, I think the most obvious procedure that comes to our minds is, hey, let's just take a vote, right? Like, what's wrong with that? If we are able to do a vote properly, if we are able to do a very fair and an unbiased means of taking a vote, then surely that would be a very reliable means of generating the social preference out of a series of individual preferences, right? So 10 friends are deciding on where to go out for lunch. Let's just ask them what they say, and whichever option has the greatest number of votes, we'll just choose that. But sadly, that system is not as reliable or as seemingly easy as it sounds, and that's what this discussion is focused towards, right? Um, we are not looking at the sort of historical and practical challenges to democracy that has been. We're purely focusing on the theory, the essence of democracy itself. What does it mean? How are we going to apply this concept in everyday situations? So here's a self-created scenario for you. I'm just going to put up the screen. There are three candidates that we need to vote for, and let's call them candidate Z, candidate I, candidate N, and then we know that 40% people have voted for Z, 35% have voted for I, and 25% people have voted for N. So who do you think would be the winner, so to speak, in this scenario? If you'd like to comment, then please. Moaz says that, well, voting can be manipulated. How can we depend on that? Well, consider the hypothetical scenario that you can't even manipulate people's votes. Let's say you can't give somebody a plate of biryani and ask them to change their votes. Let's say you control for all of these scenarios. Even then, can you rely on this method of aggregating individual preferences to generate a social preference? So, we're truly looking at the intrinsic properties of collective choice rather than looking at any sort of practical issues that might arise. So, one obvious method that we make use of in everyday scenarios, and certainly when it comes to even voting in Pakistan, is that we use something called the plurality rule, which means that we vote for our favorite option. So in this scenario, this hypothetical population has suggested that 40% say that their favorite is Z, 35% say their favorite is I, 25% say their favorite is N, right? Clearly, if we're just looking at the favorites, Z is the clear winner in this scenario. I hope there's no disagreement in that. Well, what could be a potential problem in this with this method of aggregating preferences? Would anyone like to point that out? Moaz says 40% is Z, but 60% is not Z. True, but you have to choose a winner, Moaz. Like, you can't say that not Z can be a candidate. Okay, so one of the challenges that the plurality rule faces is something called the problem of spoilers. And that's what I'm going to bring in this scenario. So if you notice here, the percentage of votes given to I and N are exactly the same as in the previous scenario, right? But now we've introduced a new candidate here, T, candidate T, and then notice that 10% of the people who were previously voting for Z as their favorite candidate are now have this choice of voting for T, and just because of the fact that they have someone they prefer more than Z, the overall output, the overall decision that the group has made has now changed, because now you've seen that the percentage preference for Z has fallen down and I has increased. So in this scenario, I would be the winner. right? So slightly technical concept. If you fully engage with it, I'm sure you can grasp this point, which is very easy, but it may take a bit of your engagement. So let's go to the previous slide again, Shumaila. So if you notice, I want you to carefully notice the percentages involved, right? I and N still have a lower percentage than Z, but just because of the fact that we have a new candidate now, uh, next slide, just because we have a new candidate in place who is the least preferred, who's the least preferred candidate here, but the this system of choosing the favorites have voted for a, so to speak, suboptimal decision for the group. These 10% of the people who are voting for T would still choose Z over I in this scenario, right? If they had a choice, they would still vote for Z. But their best choice is T in this scenario. So, because of the fact that we've introduced an external candidate, the output of the entire sort of social decision has now been in favor of a different candidate, which is I. Do people get this point? And I'd like to pause there just to see what people think. So yeah, Javed says if voting is in favor of Z restricted to a particular region, cannot enable Z to be elected overall. Um, Not sure what that means, Javed. Okay, so any comments or feedback if you do not understand this concept so far? Hmm. Okay, I'm assuming you're grasping this since I don't have a lot of visibility on what people are saying. So let's go back to the slides again. Right, full screen there. So the only challenge with the plurality rule is that the introduction of new candidates or even the removal of some existing candidates can reshape or rechange the output that's generated from that entire group, right? So the crux of the problem being that you are not comparing two individuals with each other, you're comparing them with multiple people, right? So in a choice between Z and I'm not only limiting my focus to candidate Z and candidate I. I'm also looking at Z in perspective of T and Z in perspective of N against I, right? So the way this method has been improved, or an alternate method of preference aggregation has been provided, is something called a ranking rule. And let's go to the next slide and see what that is. So in a ranking rule, you're not just putting out your most preferred candidate. You're listing out the ranks from top to bottom of all the candidates involved, right? So yeah, this way you're getting the complete picture of what the society is ranking people at, right? You're not just saying tell me your best candidate. You're also telling them tell me your worst candidate. Right? So what this mechanism allows us to do is that, as you can see, the 40% people who are voting for Z as their most preferred candidate are also saying that, well, I is the second best, N is the third best, right? So they're ranking, so to speak. And what this will allow us to do is that we can individually compare how two candidates rank up with respect to each other, and how much they are preferred on a social level, right? So the next slide will make it slightly more clear what I mean by that. So in a choice between Z and I, for example, as you can see, Z and I are highlighted. You can see that 40% of the people are in favor of Z against I, right? 35% of people are in favor of I against Z, and 25% of people are also in favor of I against Z. So, all in all, a total of, I think, 60% people are in favor of I over Z, which is exactly the point I think Moaz was making, that 60% of people do not want Z. But what this procedure allows us to do is that it helps us put a number uh, to which candidate they would prefer other than Z. So I hope this is pretty straightforward, that you can sort of single out candidates Z and I, and you can compare that how many people prefer Z over I and how many people prefer I over Z. I'm going to pause here for a second, see if there are any questions or comments so far. Yeah, Javed, that's a very good point. I think I get what you're speaking from now, but understand that we're not looking at any particular regions or any other external influences. For now, we're just simply limiting ourselves to basic numbers, basic aggregation criterias, how we're going to sum up these individual preferences and then be able to generate a social preference. How we can confidently say this is what the group wants just by adding up all the numbers. So I haven't received any comments or questions so far, so I'm going to proceed with the discussion. So I was elaborating on what this ranking rule tells us and how exactly it's operated. So just as we singled out Z and I, we will also single out other combinations in this scenario. So for example, I and N, we'll see, okay, out of I and N, how many people prefer I over N. So as you can see, it's 40 plus 35. So that's about 75% people prefer I over N, whereas 25% of people prefer N over I, right? So this way, again, you can single out just two individuals from out of however many candidates there are possible. In this example, we've taken three. And then you can see what are the social rankings of these two people that we've singled out. Let's go to the third and final permutation of this in the next slide. Right, so the final combination that we can see is that of Z and N. And as you can see, 40% people prefer Z over N, whereas 60% of the people prefer N over Z in this scenario, right? So again, this is purely a numbers game, purely a numbers example that we're examining. We're not looking at any sort of political influences that can happen, any rigging that can take place. We're just looking at the essence of the meaning of social aggregation and where challenges might arise in that. So summing up all our results, let's look at the final slide over here. So we'll add up each of these individual comparisons that we've made. And on the right hand side, if you notice the numbers in bold, you will see that that shows the aggregate preferences in a choice between two singled out candidates in each scenario, right? So as I demonstrated in a choice between Z and I, the people who said Z is better than I are 40% in number. People who said Z is better than N are also 40%. They are not the majority. In this case, the majorities have been highlighted horizontally. So as you can see, I is preferred to Z by 60% of people, so that's the majority. Similarly, I is preferred to N by 75% people, so that's also highlighted horizontally. So the idea being that once you single out these candidates, you list out their total numbers on the side and you sort of add them up. That allows us to see which candidate is better than each of the other, right? So I in this scenario is better than both Z and both N once you've individually singled out people, taken their aggregate numbers, and assess the total. So what that has enabled us to do is that we have been successfully able to get rid of the problem of spoilers which we saw earlier in the plurality rule, where the addition or the removal of a candidate can affect the choice between two people, right? So what, in very basic terms, what this concept is saying is that just um, we don't just want the most preferred option, we also want to compare how that option ranks with all the others. And it's in a sense getting much more information out of the voters. So what could be the potential problem with this scenario? Um, well, one problem that arises with this scenario, and see in the next slide, is that if I slightly tweak in the numbers of the size of the population and the um, combination of their selections, what you'll see is that we can also arrive at an arrangement of this sort, right? And what this says is that again, just focus on the highlighted horizontal rows over here. So you'll see that a majority says that Z is greater than I. A majority also says I is greater than N, right? So if Z is greater than I and I is greater than N, what does the principle of transitivity tell us? It says that Z should be also greater than N, right? That's the sort of logical conclusion. But if you look at the third horizontal colored line, it says N is greater than to Z. So in this potential combination of preferences, the society has voted for what is called an irrational outcome, so to speak. It's an illogical decision because, on one hand, through the law of transitivity, you're saying Z should be greater than N, but at the same time, you voted for N is greater than Z, right? So, in technical terms, this is something called the cyclicality of choices, which was famously highlighted by a French philosopher called Condorcet. So this is the problem that can arise with the ranking rule, right? So again, a lot of things for you guys to take in. I don't have a lot of visibility on what everybody is absorbing, or if they have any questions because of this virtual environment. Feel free to comment if you have any questions, any criticisms, any things you want me to walk through again. Um, these ideas are sort of postgraduate level discussions, which I'm trying to really make basic and very accessible to masses. So I'll just wait for a bit if people want to comment or ask any questions. Um, right. Seems like you guys are absorbing everything perfectly. Okay. So let's quickly move on then. So what we've gathered so far is that, okay, Javed Safdar says ground realities are very different. Um, what do you mean by that, Javed Saab? Would you like to elaborate on that? Hmm. So again, I think the reason why looking at this field of study might be a bit uh, tricky at first hand is because we are very used to discussing ideas of democracy in a very political or a historical context, where, like, Falana dictator did this, Falana politician did that. He was apparently a democratic. He was apparently a dictator or military ruler. This discussion is slightly distant from that, in the sense that it's purely logical, so to speak. It's the study of social choice theory is based on what's called axioms, scenarios of potential voting possibilities by individuals, and how you can aggregate that using different choice procedures. You need to come up with certain criterias of amalgamating individual choices, whether that is the plurality rule, whether that is the ranking rule, whether that is some other rule. There's tens and thousands of rules out there through which you can amalgamate different individual preferences. Muaz Shah has commented, what about the issue of statistical variation by eliminating a choice? You have a choice of three first. Yes, exactly. That is also a means of potential preference aggregation. Moaz, very it's a very good thing you pointed out. Javed says, if Z is greater than other Z's, does that not? Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to go back to the presentation. So what we've observed so far is that the plurality rule, which looks at your favorite candidate, is pretty good, but it's exposed to the problem of spoilers, or in technical terms, we call it it is not independent of irrelevant alternatives. Um, the ranking rule that we've looked at it also works really well in most scenarios, but it is exposed to the problem of producing cyclical outputs. Um, Moaz then also pointed out a third means of preference aggregation that is built on some sort of an elimination criteria, which is also common. So the key question that arises is that with all these potential preference aggregating mechanisms out there, which one is the best one? Which one should we opt for? Which one is the most reliable in giving us a decision that is not only representative of the entire community, but it is also logical in its output. We cannot have problems of transitivity, of cyclicality, such as the ones we just saw. So, what do you think is the most reliable and accurate means of preference aggregation? Um, Feel free to comment if you have any ideas. Mhm. Well, interestingly, and you don't have to put your minds in a difficult place to be able to answer that. There was a young boy who was figuring out these questions on his own, uh, as a graduate student, and his thesis was actually focused on this question of which preference aggregation mechanism would lead to the most representative and rational choices for the society, right? This boy's name was Kenneth Arrow. Um, Soon enough, something that he was just thinking about as a graduate student developed so exponentially and so impactfully that he won a Nobel Prize for his work. Right, so you can assess the sort of significance of what we're trying to understand, of it, what we're trying to answer by appreciating the fact that this work has been given a Nobel Peace Prize. Obviously, it's also going to be very complicated and technical to explain in a span of 1 hour. But I've tried my best to be able to make it as understandable by the average person. So Arrow's approach was starting the question off with asking what would be the most basic demands of. Let's stick to the previous slide. Yeah, thank you. So Arrow's approach was asking the question of what would be the most basic requirements of a preference aggregating mechanism, right? So what would be the most elementary things that any aggregating procedure that claims to be democratic should have? And he, he thought about it long and hard, and he said, well, I don't know about a lot of things, but this choice mechanism should have at least these five principles, right? Um, I've changed the names of that to be slightly more understandable and relatable. They have different names in a technical setting. But in more layman terms, what he's saying is that firstly, there should be no spoilers, right? So in a choice between A and B, I should only compare A and B. I shouldn't look at C to figure out whether I prefer A over B or B over A. So that's something that the plurality rule was not able to do, but the ranking rule was, right? So firstly, that choice mechanism should not be exposed to spoilers. Secondly, the that choice mechanism should be decisive in its output. So at the end of the day, we're not just doing this for fun and giggles, where we want an actual rational decision to come out of this. So we want an outcome that chooses one winner, ideally, and we also want it to make logical sense, right? So we don't want problems of transitivity and cyclicality, such as the ones we saw in the ranking rule. Um, his third demand out of such a choice procedure was that this should incorporate everybody's choice, right? Nobody should be said that, hey, okay, you're not going to be able to express your choices in this scenario. You're not smart enough, you're not rich enough, you're not from our race, or whatever the reason may be. Everybody's opinion should matter, right? Everybody's vote counts, everybody's preference matters, and it matters equally. You're not going to say that this person's vote counts twice as much and this person's vote costs half as much. So you're going to admit all potential preferences in this choice procedure. His fourth principle was that of consensus, right? So if uh, a group of people are preferring X over Y, then the society must move towards X over Y. It cannot be that you are preferring X over Y and the output is not in that direction, so to speak, right? So it's a very basic idea. And then in the last point was there should be no dictators, right? So no single individual or a group of people should be able to dictate what the group's decision would be. Only if these five criteria are met, according to Arrow, which he thinks are very basic requirements, only then would a choice procedure would be truly democratic. So I would like to hear your viewpoints on this, if possible. What do you think about Arrow's conditions? Do you think these are reasonable conditions that Arrow is making? Do you think he should add a few things there? Do you think he should remove a few of the requirements? Hmm. Okay. So most people, most of the academics believe that these are very basic demands, and they. Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So let's put up the presentation again, Shumaila. Thank you. So what Arrow found out at the end of his really thorough analysis of different sort of aggregative choice mechanism. He looked at the plurality rule, he looked at the majority rule, he looked at the elimination rule that Moaz pointed out. He looked at hundreds of other procedures, and what his conclusion was after analyzing all of this, for which he got a Nobel Prize, by the way. Let's look at the next slide, Shumaila. He found out that uh, there's no choice procedure that would satisfy all of these five conditions at the same time, right? So, quite like what Moaz predicted, that you cannot get rid of the plurality rule. Um, you're partly right in that context. You can't get rid of the spoiler situation. Sorry. So you're partly right about that, Moaz, because yes, there are some axioms that you will have to sacrifice at the cost of others, right? So, in the interest of time, I'll skip the next two slides, which would I think a bit more technical in nature. So let's skip these. But let's go on the one previous one. So amongst these five demands that any democratic decision-making procedure makes from us, we have to give away at least one in order to be able to come at a decision that is both representative of the people and at the same time it's logical. So that may not be necessarily, a too demanding of a scenario. You can easily see why it can be very plausible, right? So, for example, that the requirement that you need to accept everybody's preferences the way they are, well, perhaps you need to modify that requirement in certain scenarios. Perhaps the issue is that people are not on the same page on the discussion, right? People's motivations when they come up and discuss about a certain issue are linked to ideas that are not really relevant to that discussion, right? So, for example, you might be influenced by, let's say, cultural or social or political norms when you're favoring a certain policy over the other, or whether you're um, expressing your interest between policy A over policy B. It may not be because you think policy A is um, intrinsically good or bad. It might just be because someone you follow or someone you respect in your social or political environment prefers that, and that's why you're opting for that. So the idea being that in this scenario, you have to restrict the domain of admissible inputs of people's preferences, and you have to put them in an environment where they can deliberate and discuss the essence of the problem at hand, right? So I mean, if you've seen that movie 12 Angry Men, you can think of that scenario where people don't just put their choices in a piece of paper and then you just draw out the right answer and say, well, this is what the answer that most people have voted for. That's not what democracy is. Perhaps it is one that is deliberative in nature, that you're forced to discuss the concepts, get into the depths of things, figure out what are the underlying issues that are being discussed, and then when you're on the same page of the problem at hand, only then you can express which preference you'd like to go for, right? When you've gotten rid of all the other unvoiced preferences or inclinations, only then can you be in a position where you can completely freely express your perspectives and be able to generate a winner. These ideas might seem a bit not very easy to grasp at instance, but I hope you can appreciate the sort of how do I say, the motive behind it. These can be expressed in a bit more technical and thorough scenario, but for now I think in the interest of the majority we can just um, explain it in a conceptual manner. So in this scenario, where I express the significance of deliberation, you can see why um, you have to restrict the requirement that you need to accept everybody's choice. Let's go to the next slide. Um, and you can see that perhaps you can even relax the possibility that there should be no dictators, right? So in this sense, dictators aren't really understood in the traditional sense of the word dictator. um, you can think of them as experts, right? You can think of it as perhaps people who are more knowledgeable in that particular field, right? So maybe if it's the practice of medicine, and you want to figure out, whether drug A is better than drug B, you wouldn't really say, well, everybody can give a vote on whether drug A is better than B. You can have a select group of people, and they can make their selection of whether A is better than B. So in this context, you can relax the requirement that a minority may not be able to make decision for the majority, right? So you can still have a democratic decision in a sense, but you need to sort of rethink of what democracy means in that sense, right? So you willfully nominated these people to give their choice in the selection of what drug is the best option. This can be thought of as representatives in parliament as well. If truly in a democratic way you've chosen your representatives and they are actually representing your beliefs and your voices in the parliament, then you don't need to vote actively yourself on every single matter. You can just have these few people make the decisions for you. So in this context, you're relaxing the axiom that says no dictators are required, right? Let's go to the next slide. Decisiveness of the decision, right? So another requirement that we discussed out of any choice mechanism was that the output you should get should be decisive. It shouldn't be illogical, so to speak. It shouldn't be cyclical. But perhaps that is too demanding of a requirement. In real life, the decision of a group is not the same as the decision of an individual. Issues can be very complex for you to be able to force an answer out of, and perhaps in certain situations, it might be best to just leave things open-ended, so to speak, right? So you can think of issues that come to the UN Security Council, for example, when matters may be too sensitive for the group to be able to make a decision immediately at the cost of people suffering, right? So you don't want that the sense of urgency uh, demands you to be able to make a decision that is not the most optimal decision, right? So perhaps decisiveness is not a key requirement in all scenarios, right? So the final slide of this presentation just sums up the entire lecture for today. And what we get to is that we need to think or rethink of what democracy exactly means, right? It's not the case that there is a one size fits all solution out there that you can apply to every case, saying that, well, this is the uh, preference aggregating mechanism that can be applied in all scenarios and it will produce truly democratic outcomes. You need to rethink which axiom or in each situation can be relaxed. Perhaps it's the one of collective rationality, perhaps it's the one of universal domain that says you can accept all inputs, uh, perhaps it's the one that says no spoilers should be allowed. um, we need to be accustomed to the idea that democracy can mean all of these things and none of them at the same time. So that is the gist of today's session. I'm sorry if it wasn't super interactive because of the virtual setting, but I hope all of you got to take something out of it. Feel free to comment your questions and criticisms later on. I'm happy to answer them through. Uh, in the meantime, this is the end of the today's session. Thank you for those who joined.